Next, from Springfield, we attend a committee hearing on Governor Rauner's proposed pension reforms. We'll hear from Steven Koch, Deputy Mayor of Chicago, as well as representatives from the Office of the Governor and the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. This runs about 45 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Madam Chairwoman, members of the committee, thank you for giving us a chance to testify before you today. My name is Steve Koch. I'm the Deputy Mayor of the City of Chicago. We're here to talk about the governor's pension proposals. Our understanding is that they haven't been filed in either chamber of the legislature yet, but the proposals, as we understand it, raises two issues that I'd like to talk about today. The first is Chicago's police and fire pension funds. In late May of this year, of 2015, with your help, as you all know, we were able to pass legislation that is known as Senate Bill 777. 777 accomplishes several goals. The measure aligns Chicago's police and fire pension payments closer to the funding plans defined in 2010 for the downstate police and fire pension plans. The bill provides a sustainable solution to secure the safety of our police and fire funds. The payment schedule is consistent with actuarial recommendations, with funding levels remaining stable during the 5-year ramp-up that the bill calls for, and under the provision of SB 777, the fund's assets will grow to be 90% funded under our current plan by 2055. As of now, and obviously depending on investment returns, the city's employer contribution for fiscal 2017 is over $670 million, and our employer contribution is scheduled to rise in fiscal 2020 under that legislation to approximately $824 million just for those two funds. Finally, the bill provides for an adjustment to the poverty level for the annuitants who receive the least amount of benefits from the fund. These are traditionally the oldest widows who receive death benefits. Mayor Emanuel worked very hard with our police and fire labor leaders to craft the proposal that became Senate Bill 777. We believe these changes represent our best efforts to stabilize ailing funds and provide more security that our first responders deserve. The second issue I want to discuss today is how the governor's proposals affect the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. Based on an early draft of his proposal, the governor has proposed for the state of Illinois to pay the normal cost of benefits paid by the Teachers Pension Fund, I'll call it CTPF for shorthand, in fiscal year 2016 and 2017. Before I address that specific proposal, it might be useful if I give you a little background on the financial health of CPS to you as of this morning. At the close of fiscal 2014, CTPF was 51.5% funded. Just parenthetically, I'd note that TRS is currently about 44% funded. CPS has always complied with state law when it comes to making its employer contribution. Last year's employer contribution was over $630 million. The state of Illinois, in its fiscal 2015 budget, appropriated a total of $62 million to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. $50 million of that $62 million was from a standalone appropriation. And I should say, for that $50 million contribution, we're grateful and we appreciate that. The remaining $12 million is a result of the statutorily obligated contribution from the state to the pension fund. We've had independent actuaries look at it, and those third-party studies verify that the majority of the funding deficit currently seen in CTPF is not due to CPS's contribution level to the fund. Rather, it is primarily a result of factors like market changes and the operating assumptions, actuarial assumptions made by the pension fund. Nonetheless, CPS's expenses are on the rise due to significant mandated employer pension contributions. Because of our rising employer contributions, we've cut over $740 million over the past 4 years from the CPS budget. We've done our best to keep those cuts away from the classroom, but the fact of the matter is that CPS's pension payment obligations have placed CPS itself in dire financial straits. We've come before this body on numerous occasions regarding CPS's financial outlook, As of July 1st of this year, CPS begins its fiscal year with about a $1.1 billion deficit. As a result of that, the Board of Education announced about $200 million in cuts, including about 1,000 people who will be laid off as a result of that, leaving the district with about a $900 million deficit as of today. It's important to note that $676 million of that $900 million deficit, or about 75.1% of our remaining deficit, is what is made up by the fiscal 2016 employer pension payment. I'd also note that codified in state law today is a paragraph that says, as when pensions were addressed in 1995, it is the intention of the Illinois General Assembly to contribute to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund 20 to 30% of what the state contributes to TRS. Despite this stated intent, the state of Illinois has not contributed even 10% of its TRS appropriation to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund since 1995. As of now, as you know, state law mandates only a $12 million contribution by the state to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. If the state were to pay just normal cost, the so-called normal cost this year to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, that payment of its normal cost would be less than 6% of what the state is contributing for normal contributions to TRS, so far less than the 20 to 30% stated as the intention of the General Assembly in 1995. Under the governor's pension proposal, as we understand it, the state would contribute 2 years of normal costs for fiscal year 2016 and 2017. This would result in a contribution of about $200 million a year. Just as important to the pension amendment that what we're discussing today, it's important to discuss what the proposal does not say. The amendment proposes absolutely no structural changes, increased state contributions to the fund, or any other reforms to the Article 17 fund. Thus, the amendment returns CPS to the exact financial position in which we find ourselves today, beginning in 2018. City of Chicago is certainly very grateful that the governor finally, or does now, acknowledge that the state should contribute to paying a portion of the employer pension obligation for Chicago teachers. Although state contributions to the CTPF are an excellent start, the plan fails to address the structural problems that we think are very much at the heart of CPS's pension and fiscal situation. Specifically, the plan does not provide for either pension parity or any form of permanent increase in state funding for education. As a result, we have to say that the plan falls far short of offering the long-term solution for CPS that is so sorely needed. Despite these shortcomings, the City of Chicago looks forward to working in partnership with the General Assembly and the Governor to find a path to a permanent solution to CPS's pension situation and education funding. I really can't overstress enough the need for a long-term solution. This crisis affects CPS's ability to provide for the needs of our children in their classrooms, and I think we all know that's some of the state's neediest children. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have regarding this.
I think, though, what concerns me, and I won't speak for Leader Neckridge, she's certainly able to speak for herself, but what's overlooked about Senate Bill 1 and that court decision was the extra discipline that was poured into those funds by Senate Bill 1. Above and beyond what I think was probably fiscally prudent. I mean, it was probably the most overlooked aspect of the bill was how much we took each year of the savings from the benefit reductions and went right back into the fund to bolster up the floor. And the court, for all I know, they didn't even get to that point. Unfortunately, they glossed right over it and went right to benefit reductions. So while it may not be useful to speculate, respectively, Mr. Koch, from your perspective, it's certainly important for us to speculate on what our role is going to try to be to fix these funds outside of a benefit reduction plan. We've had good hearings on the governor's proposal the last 2 weeks, and there's certainly a lot I think many of us have challenges with, but I think one of the underlying themes is there's got to be a new approach from what the benefit reduction side is. And I think it would be wise, to the extent it's possible, to, of course, assert your rights in court and see what the Supreme Court says. But it would probably be wise to let us consider Plan Bs for you if you're not quite there yet mentally. So thank you for answering my questions, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Representative Morrison?
The last time the teacher's contract was up for renewal, what was the amount of their raise, their annual raise? Or their annual raises, I should say, for the terms of their contract?
To be honest, I don't recall. It was, I believe, a couple of % a year. I honestly don't recall. You presumably know the answer, but I don't know.
I know it's more than a couple % a year.
Yeah.
But my question is, during the negotiations with the union, did the issue of the pension crisis come up, and the difficulty for for CPS to make its pension contributions, what the consequences would be?
I think it's fair to say it's quite well known that that was not it was not a peaceful labor negotiation. It in fact resulted in a strike, first one in some time. It was an extremely difficult process, I think, for the city, for CPS, for the teachers union, for everybody involved. And I think it's fair to say the financial situation of CPS was very much front and center. You could hardly read any media outlet in the city of Chicago. In fact, I would suggest in that region, in maybe all over the state, while that was going on. So I think it was well known, all of the funding issues associated with CPS, whether it was from the revenue side or the cost side.
And when is their contract up for renewal again?
I believe the contract is up now.
Okay. I mean, what you cited in terms of layoffs and, just an inability to pay for current expenditures, it's important that we discuss that along the lines of the pension crisis that we're facing. And, as teachers are watching this, or, paying attention to the proceedings and Governor Rauner's proposal for changes, I would just like to add the conversation that if we don't fix this problem, I mean, yes, we have to deal with the court's decision, but we have to get creative. We have to maybe look at a constitutional amendment, because if we don't do that, we're going to look at continued layoffs, cuts in current needs, and that's just not good for the kids. It's not good for the families in Chicago or for the other districts around the state. So anyway, thank you for, again, testifying.
Sure. Thank you.
Representative Ives?
Deputy Mayor, you spent a lot of time talking about CPS, which I find is interesting, considering you have many other funds to be concerned about as the city of Chicago. That seems to be your overarching problem. But I do have questions about CPS, and when they come up, or the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund, I'll probably address them there and then at that time. But just looking at it in totality, when you look at what the city of Chicago resident owes for debt and unfunded liability, and I mean, actually Barron's did a really good article on this not even a year ago. I mean, it's 7 times the amount of revenue that you have, 7 times. So you could essentially fund nothing but pay your debt and unfunded liability for 7 entire years, and only then be out of debt. I mean, not fill one pothole, not run one school, nothing. I mean, that's an inordinate amount of liability. And I don't think that any of the solutions that have come up yet are strong enough to actually solve this problem? And you said two things in your remark. One, that there was no reforms necessarily in the CPS portion of Governor Rauner's proposal, and two, that you need a long-term solution. I mean, how do you get there? I mean, can you lay out what exactly your reforms are to get there, to actually end this as a crisis? I'm tired of talking about it, and I've only been here 3 years.
So the question is,
The question is, what is your long-term solution? Because I don't see it in the plans that have been put forward so far. I just see it as a way and a measure to just get through the next crisis. I don't see a long-term solution here.
well, what we have said, what the mayor has repeatedly said is, as you know, this is a function of state law. We are extremely interested in working with the legislature, both houses. We're extremely interested in working with the governor. And I think it's fair to say the mayor is very engaged with both the legislature and the governor on this subject. What he has said publicly, and the CPS's position, and the city's position, the mayor's position, has consistently been that to reach a long-term fix in this, there's probably three main components. One is an equitable treatment of CPS relative to every other school district in Illinois. The current situation is just CPS is treated meaningfully differently, objectively so. Maybe that's what people intend, but we certainly think that is manifestly unfair, inequitable, and ultimately unsustainable. Secondly, ultimately there needs to be a funding system for education in Illinois that deals fairly across the state and probably ultimately meaningfully raises the level of resources devoted to education. I think it's been our position that it's hard for the state of Illinois to say to itself, it's a good thing to be amongst the last in the nation in terms of funding education. Thirdly, we have aggressively cut costs at CPS over the last 4.5 years. Unarguably, it's part of the public record that we have taken, as I mentioned, $740 million of cuts before this year, and in the latest budget, an incremental $200 million. If you look at the CPS budget, there are extremely hard choices to be made from here forward if we're to continue to cut that budget. That being said, the mayor has said very explicitly that if there is equitable pension treatment and increased revenue for education, there will also be shared pain on the part of CPS itself, and probably and we would ask for shared sacrifice on the part of all the parties that are part of CPS, both teachers, administrators, and ultimately the people who benefit from CPS. And that has to be part of this. So all three things we regard as central. And, to some extent they are moving pieces, but I think a solution, a long-term solution, is what we're after. We don't want to be here again. I don't think I can tell you from the standpoint of the health of the city and ultimately the health of the Illinois economy, it is a terrible thing for this kind of uncertainty to persist and to be present every year. And I don't think anybody here would think that's a good thing. It does not benefit the state for this to be a continuing topic, and we need ultimately to come out of this a viable, long-term, sustainable solution. And I think it will include all three of those components.
Okay, so let me tell you what I hear. I hear that spending $14,000 per student per year is insufficient to educate a child in Chicago. That's what I hear. I also would like to note that essentially what you're talking about is all a matter of adding more revenue, new money to systems that have already failed our children and the taxpayers. So I hear no real reform solutions. I want to hear things like we need to move to a hybrid or a defined contribution program for new and future employees. We need to more aggressively cut costs and hold down mismanagement, such as the $20 million Bird Bennett problem that you currently have. We need to look at reforming how we deliver education. I don't see anything in your long-term solutions that say anything but let's give more money to a system that has failed. And you are very familiar, I'm sure, with this Senate Republicans report that essentially says that the Chicago public school system receives on the order of $800 million more than they should receive. Would they need to go through normal funding mechanisms that the rest of the schools do go through? So I don't know actually if we're even close in coming to an agreement here on how to solve this problem.
Well, I don't know whether we're close to coming to an agreement or not, but I would say two things in response to that. First, the mayor has said repeatedly that we are more than happy to go to be treated the same as other school districts and go through the same funding mechanism and have our pensions treated the same way as other districts are. We think CPS would come out $400 million ahead if we were to do that, and that would be a fine solution. So eliminate what is perceived as a somehow advantageous or somehow wrong block grant system that you currently have. Take us to the same pension funding system as the rest of the state, the same funding system for education as the rest of the state, and CPS will be better off. It doesn't fix the problem, but it would go a good bit of the way. So that would be fine if we really want to address that. I think it is not by any standard that we look at the numbers, we can't figure out, we don't get to that proposition that somehow Chicago benefits by some kind of alleged way of funding that advantages Chicago in a way it shouldn't. We think we are manifestly disadvantaged by the current funding system. Okay. Secondly, I would take issue with your proposition that CPS is a failed system. There is enormous progress that has been made in the last 4.5 years. Our graduations rates are manifestly up. I don't think anybody could have sat in this body 6 or 7 years ago and said 5 of the top 10 high schools in the state would be CPS high schools. I don't think a soul here would have said that. I don't think anybody would have said 10 of the best elementary schools in the state would be CPS elementary schools. I think that does a disservice to the enormous effort that the Chicago teachers have put in to fixing the system, the enormous work that the administrators of CPS have put in to fixing it, to the very hard work done by the family and students of CPS that have gone to making CPS demonstrably a meaningfully improved school system. I think it also does disservice to the sacrifices that have been made in terms of cost. We've taken, with this year's budget cuts, $940 million out of its budget. That's an enormous amount of money. I would put that up against any school system in the state, and I think it's just unfair to say it's broken. In a $4 billion budget, there are undoubtedly mistakes and things that in retrospect we wouldn't do again. I'm not going to comment on the particular one you mentioned, but that is hardly, that amount of money is hardly an excuse for saying the current funding system makes sense. It doesn't. And I would say it can't be in the interests of the legislature. It's not in the interest of the state. I'm sure it is not in the interest of anybody in this room to say we want a system that doesn't provide for a sustainable, stable future in which a school system can focus on educating kids and getting better each year in constant improvement, as opposed to worrying about whether or not it can open schools in the fall. That's where we were a couple of months ago. We were literally worried about whether we were going to open schools. That is not to the benefit of the state of Illinois, the city of Chicago, or any of its residents.
Oh, and I would absolutely agree with you, but you can't cherry pick the data. But I'm going to move on because this is getting way off the pension discussion. You can't cherry pick the data, though, and it'd be interesting to compare numbers on who's going to benefit if you actually come under the funding scheme, the funding formula that the rest of us live by. One other thing, though, you specifically said that you have always completed, in accordance with state law, the payments that you were required to make to the pension system. Now, am I not wrong that for 10 years you essentially contributed nothing, and then for 3 years additionally, later on, basically contributed nothing as well to the pension systems?
As I understand that history, and I wasn't here at the time, and I take it you weren't either, but as I understand the history, and others who may have been around here at the time could speak directly to it, we made what were the state-required payments in each of those years. As I understand state law, in years in which the pension system was funded over the level where the employer is required to make a contribution, which I believe is 90%. So the CTPF was funded at over 90% in the years in which it was not required to make a payment by state law, and CPS at that time chose not to make a payment. It is also the case we asked our actuaries, the fund's actuaries, to look at this, because I know it has come up in various discussions on this matter, and I'd say two things about it. First, our understanding, based on what the actuaries have told us, is the majority of the underfunding that exists in CTPF's fund today is due to things other than whether or not the payments were made. In fact, that's
That is
consistent
true.
with what
Yep.
you would think an actuarial report means. So if we were over 100% funded, then in fact, we should have been fine. So losses in investments, which were consistent with what the general market was doing at the time, as well as changes in actuarial assumptions and changes in benefits, led to the underfunding of today. Not dissimilar from many other funds in the state. It's also the case that if you go back to 1995, when this current pension arrangement was reached, the Illinois legislature said it was its intention that the state would contribute each year to CPS 20 to 30% to the CTPF of what it was contributing to TRS. It did that for the first year, for 1995. For every year after 1995, it basically held that number constant, or it went down, while the actual pension amount that it was paying to TRS went up by a multiple of many times. So the city continued to get roughly $50 million a year until it got even less, while the TRS contribution grew to be hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, to the point where the state contribution to CTPF is about 1 or 2%, while its contribution to TRS obviously is massively more. So what the city did in those years, since it didn't get the contribution from the state, as I understand it, CPS didn't get that contribution, therefore did not pass it on to CTPF. So I think, look, I wasn't here, you weren't here. I don't know that I can put myself in the minds of what went on. What I do know is CPS did not receive the payment the state said it was going to make to it, and two, it complied with state law in order to keep its resources focused on education, which is what they did during that time period.
Okay, there's no doubt that the politicians of the past played games with these funds and did not fund them. So I'm going to agree with that. Thank you.
Our regulars, Dennis Marasco and Mike Mahoney, back with us today.
Morning.
Good morning.
Madam Chair, I'll say again that we're happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to respond. Let me just set the stage. What we would like to do is, as we move forward analyzing this bill section by section, let's recap what's happened in the past 3 hearings before this committee, briefly. We introduced the bill, we defended it, we explained why, in our view, it's constitutional and why it addresses the systemic pension problem that the state is facing, and why we think this is the way forward. And then over the course of several panels, we've heard 2 basic points in opposition. One of them, which was repeated just now, we have to tax our way out of this problem. So suffice it to say, if we're going to sit here and discuss the governor's pension approach, we should point out that at the very basis of this approach is our rejection of the idea that the only way forward is to look for revenue. I mean, we think we can accomplish changes to all of the state's pension systems through ways that address this problem, that do not require us to sit here and resign us to the fact that the only way forward is to look for revenue. The second opposition we've heard is on the collective bargaining front. I mean, we've heard several panels, and they've suggested that the changes that we've proposed do some significant harm to collective bargaining in the state of Illinois. And what I want to point out is there was one person on a panel last week, I think it was the second speaker, and I apologize, I don't remember the name, but I think it was
Won't be able to help you on that.
Fraternal Order of Police, I think it was an FOP representative, who made a terrific point. He said, he extolled the virtues of collective bargaining, and he gave us many examples. And I wrote them down because they were very significant. Work rules, operational decisions, equal treatment of employees, transfer rights, shift rules, rotations, training opportunities, and another person then mentioned subcontracting. All of those things are important to the unions. All of those things they negotiate. All of those things, the collective bargaining reforms that were put in the state of Illinois a long time ago, have allowed them to achieve. The reason it's significant, of course, is because all of those items remain subject of collective bargaining. There, right there, you had a representative from the labor sector who told this committee that, yes, in fact, those are very important things, and all of those things remain subject of collective bargaining. So it's inconsistent to move forward to say that this does a lot of violence to collective bargaining in the state of Illinois, because by the very nature of this bill, what's left subject of collective bargaining is quite significant. And as I think we mentioned to the committee the first time we talked a couple of weeks ago, we pointed out that we spend a lot of time discussing all of those items with the unions at the negotiating table. And the reason for that is it's not mysterious. If you think about, what motivates you? You show up to work and you have good pay, you have good vacation, but what is it that actually drives how you feel about your place of employment? It's the work rules, right? It's somebody telling you that you're doing a good job. It's somebody telling you that you're valued in this job and how you're being treated day to day. That's what motivates people. That's what makes them feel good about their day-to-day conditions of employment. All of those things remain subject of collective bargaining as a result of the governor's pension proposal. And so with that, Madam Chair, I just want to wrap it up quickly and suggest that as we move forward in this subject matter hearings and discuss the governor's proposal, we do that with the understanding and with the correct understanding of what's actually in the bill, and that what we're looking to do is not to do some drastic change to collective bargaining in the state of Illinois. What we are after is a pension system that the state can afford, that the taxpayers can afford, and that we can all move forward and make the proper changes so that we don't face this huge problem that we have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Lois Ashford, and I am the Vice President of the Chicago Teachers
I'm
Pension.
so sorry. They have Lewis written on my sheet, and
That's
I should have
okay.
known that.
That's
I
okay.
apologize.
It's okay. And I am the Vice President of the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. In addition to the role as Vice President, I serve as the Legislative Chair of our fund's Pensions, Laws, and Rules Committee. I hold a membership in the Chicago Teachers Union and have over 20 years of teaching experience as an active teacher. On behalf of the other 11 trustees, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity and your willingness to hear our thoughts. Hopefully we can address some of our concerns, and maybe you can help us out. During my 6 years tenure as a trustee, I have observed a large number of pension reform proposals introduced in the General Assembly. And in my opinion, none have been more harmful than Public Act 96-0889. That became law on April 14th, 2010. Under that law, the Chicago Board of Education was allowed to shirk its responsibilities for 3 years and underfund the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund to the tune of over $1 billion, while extending the pension payment ramp by an additional 14 years. Governor Rauner's pension reform proposal appears to right that wrong, but only partially. Requiring the state to pay normal costs for the Chicago Teacher Pension Fund has been a long-term goal for CTPF and the General Assembly. In fact, in 1995, it was the General Assembly that amended Article 17, Section 17-127 to say, the General Assembly finds that for many years the state has contributed to the fund an annual amount that is 20 and 30% of the amount of the annual state contribution to Article 16 retirement system. And the General Assembly declares that it is its goal and intention to continue this level of contribution to the fund in the future. And while the thought of seeing that goal accomplished is satisfying, it is also bittersweet. Governor Rauner's proposal would allow the state to make normal cost contributions, including a $65 million contribution for retiree state health insurance for FY16 and FY17. But what happens in FY18 or 19? As a fiduciary, my job is to administer health insurance benefits, and CTPF has shared in the cost of these retiree health insurance benefits since 1986. However, CTPF is limited by state law to the amount it can spend to subsidize health insurance premiums, and that amount is currently $65 million. Not only is that amount severely outdated, but it has not been amended since 2004. To make matters worse, this does not keep in line with the current healthcare expenditures or inflation. With almost 30,000 retirees who rely upon the pension fund for health insurance, we find this section of the proposal to be incomplete. In keeping with the theme of inadequacy, I find it extremely questionable as a fiduciary that a local public entity would be allowed to initiate a Chapter 9 filing, better known as bankruptcy. This proposal essentially shoves our employer, the Chicago Public Schools, into a tailspin of continued fiscal irresponsibility. Over the past 10 years, CTPF has consistently advocated for responsible financial practices which would improve district finances and increase stability of the fund. Not only has CPS consistently rejected those initiatives designed to improve the fund's outlook, but now we have an administration that appears to be encouraging the financial ruin of the pension fund that is beholden to over 63,000 participants. We find this to be unconscionable and unacceptable. CTPF was established in 1895, and it is the state's oldest pension fund. It is my understanding that this pension reform proposal was put forward by the governor's office as a way to broker discussions and encourage dialogue. We would strongly implore this administration to work with us to establish full funding through guaranteed revenue, House Bill 3695. Review our proposals for stabilizing the health insurance of thousands of participants and reject any future proposals by our employer that would lead to a failing grade in pension fund solvency. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to address each of you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
That's fine, thank you. Good morning, my name is Tiffany Reeves. I'm the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Legal Officer of the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund, which I'll refer to as CTPF. I want to thank you for taking the time to consider this very serious matter of of pension funding and how the pension reform proposal affects the interest of over 63,000 active and retired Chicago teachers. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today and to offer specific information about CTPF and its participants. This year, CTPF proudly celebrates its 120-year anniversary. With proper actuarial-based funding, CTPF will continue to serve countless generations to come. Prior to 1995, CTPF received the direct proceeds of a dedicated tax levy. This levy ensured that the fund had a steady stream of revenue to bolster investments and to fund benefit payments. Unfortunately, in 1995, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, looked to the pension fund to solve its budgetary problems, and the proceeds of the tax levy were redirected to the CPS general operating budget. From 1996 to 2005, CPS received $1.6 billion in pension tax revenue, but contributed nothing to the Chicago Teachers Pension Fund. CPS was required to resume making the payments in 2006, but CPS was unprepared to pay the resulting ramp-up in contributions, and CPS asked lawmakers for additional relief. As Ms. Ashford mentioned, in 2010, the legislation cut CPS payments for a 3-year period and extended the funding schedule for another 14 years until 2059. This legislation cost CTPF an additional $1.2 billion in revenue. Over the last 15 years, CTPF's funded ratio has dropped from 100% to just over 50%. Although CTPF has a sound and well-diversified investment strategy, over the past 35 years, CTPF investments have yielded a 9.13% return against a 7.75% benchmark. CTPF has simply not received the funding necessary to provide for current and future retirees. On average, CTPF is forced to liquidate between $80 and $100 million per month in assets to pay the required benefits payments. Administering a defined benefit plan requires certainty. Any legislation which creates further uncertainty regarding revenue, benefits, or remedies in the event of non-payment undermines the certainty that is an essential element of a defined benefit program. CTPF opposes the municipal bankruptcy provisions within the pension reform proposal, as this creates uncertainty about CTPF's revenue stream and its potential remedies in the event of non-payment, given the subordination of pension liabilities under the current structure. CTPF is concerned about the Tier 1 choice model because of the clear dispute regarding the constitutionality of the consideration approach. Moreover, CTPF should not bear the cost or burden of administering the election provisions of the proposed budget. Clearly, Chicago Public Schools is in the best position to administer the election, given its access to active teachers and information and resources. It would not be appropriate to spend pension fund assets on this election. In addition, the implementation timeline as set forth in the proposed budget is not realistic given CTPF's current technological limitations. The technology update alone would take upwards of a year to implement and would cost CTPF approximately $500,000. The fund should not bear this cost. It is not a reasonable cost of administering a defined benefit program. Although CTPF is pleased with the state funding of normal cost, the other provisions of the proposed budget create further uncertainty that has a destabilizing effect on investment returns and benefit payments. CTPF has acted cautiously and invested prudently, and the employees have always paid their share. CTPF cannot survive on investment earnings alone. This does not provide financial security. It is imperative that any pension reform proposal contain full actuarial-based funding and leave open a mechanism for enforcing the promise made to Chicago teachers. I thank you again for the opportunity to share this important information about CTPF.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.